Hey, welcome back to my channel. We are carrying on with our corset series, and today we are talking about making your mock-up. So we've already done a lot in this series. We have sourced patterns, we've talked about fabric, we've talked about boning, we have adjusted our patterns to try and get the best fit right from the pattern, and now we are going to sew our mock-up so that we can do any final tweaks to that fit. Now you're going to see me sort of go back and forth between two different mock-ups that I'm working on. I am doing an overbust from, and I can't believe this, I am so sorry, I've been saying her name wrong this entire time. I've been saying Ariana Black, and it's Ariana Black. Totally my fault. Didn't read it correctly, so I apologize. But I am doing an overbust corset from Ariana Black. I will link her website down below. All of her patterns are free. And I'm also going to be doing a pattern from freesewing.org, which if you haven't seen the previous videos, they are a website that gives you made-to-measure patterns. You put in your measurements and then they tweak the pattern for you. They don't guarantee that there's no further tweaking that's going to be needed for fit, but just that it would be much less. Which, I mean, I'm quite hopeful for, because when I printed out the pattern pieces, the pattern for the underbust corset that was made to my measurements was the same length as the overbust corset from Ariana Black. Which, I mean, I'm used to having to lengthen all of my patterns anyways. I'm over 6 feet tall. It's just a thing I have to do. So I'll be going back and forth between both of those. I did not do any pattern adjustments to the freesewing.org just because I wanted to see. It was just an experiment. I wanted to see how close it would actually be to my body shape. So I didn't do any measuring myself and measuring the pattern, like none of that happened. So whatever happens, happens, and it'll be cool to see how close it is to what I actually need. Now, if you've been following along and doing the steps along with me, you will have your corset pattern pieces. And they look very narrow most of the time. Where am I? These are the freesewing.org, and I had some people comment like on how small the pattern pieces are. And they are small. But a lot of corset patterns are not going to include seam allowance. Now, if you went out and got a big 4 pattern, it likely will have seam allowance, and then it will have instructions on how they want you to bone the corset. The reason that a lot of corset patterns do not have seam allowance included is because lots of people have different ways of boning their corset. Also, if you're getting it from a historical sewing resource, then people want to be able to mark the pattern directly onto the fabric so that they have their stitching lines. So it's a good thing because you wind up with options on how much seam allowance you want to have based on what's going to be best for how you are going to sew your corset. Now, if you are getting a corset from Ariana Black, then she leaves enough room on the page that when you go to cut out your pattern pieces, you can mark your seam allowance right on the paper and cut that out altogether if you wish. Not all corset patterns are like that because they're kind of trying to fit together closely so that they can print out and not waste too much paper. I prefer, honestly, to just cut the pattern pieces out and add my seam allowance right on the fabric for a couple of reasons. One, I might want to try making that same corset again and doing a different boning treatment. And so I might need different seam allowances. And don't worry, we're going to get more into the different ways that you can bone a corset next week. We're just worried about mock-ups. So really, whatever seam allowance you have is fine for your mock-up. Whatever you're used to sewing with. And sometimes because you are working with such narrow pieces, it can be really handy to go ahead and mark your stitching lines right on your fabric so that you're not like accidentally kind of going astray. So I mean, it might be kind of like a new weird thing for people to have a pattern that doesn't include seam allowance, but that's the first thing that you need to figure out is what seam allowance you're going to use. Usually for me, if I'm going to use boning casing instead of using the actual seam allowances to create my casing, I just do like a 1/2 inch seam allowance or even like a 1/4 inch if I'm really tight on fabric. So, step 1. Mark your seam allowances, however you want to do that, on the paper, on the fabric. It's just a thing you gotta do. while you are working on your corset pieces, I mean, this is a very different garment with very different shaped pattern pieces from anything else you probably sew. You know, if you sew a shirt, it's pretty easy to tell, you know, the back from an arm. In this case, though, I mean, where does that one go? Like, they're kind of very similarly shaped. So it's important that for the sake of your own sanity, make sure that you either like lay your pattern pieces out in the correct order to sew them, making sure, double check that you have the top and the bottom are at the top and the bottom. You don't want like half of your hip width to be like under your armpit by accident. And you can even go ahead and just use some chalk and mark it right on your fabric so that you can see the consecutive numbers when you are sewing things together. The one mock-up I didn't sew it how I would normally sew a mock-up because I really liked the fabric, and I thought, maybe I can just have this work out well enough that I can use it for my final corset as well. But I was using scraps. I had all these scraps left over from our Christmas pajamas, and because I was working with scraps instead of just folding fabric over and making sure that I got those like proper mirror images, I did try to pattern match so that at least my horizontal lines would be straight, and then I just totally messed it up. So that's not going to happen now. But it did mean that I did not sew that mock-up as I normally would. The blue one with the gold pinstriping though, that is how I would normally sew a mock-up. The blue one is the freesewing.org. It is the underbust. And I sewed that one with the intention of having boning channels sewn to some, not all, the centers of some of the panels. Now generally in a corset, you're gonna have boning channels on your seams. You might add other boning channels through the middles of panels and stuff like that too. But on your seams is kind of like a guaranteed spot where you are definitely gonna put boning channel. Not so on the mock-up, because you want access to those seams so that you can let them open if you need to, or you can pinch them closed more if you need to. So the best practice as far as I'm concerned is make sure that your front has boning if it doesn't have a busk. If it's a closed front, add boning to it. Try and have boning in at least one spot under the arm or on the side. I think in this one I actually did 2 spots on the side. And make sure that you have boning at the back so that you can do your closures. I don't bother putting binding on my mock-ups. I just put the boning in and you'll see like bits of boning sticking out. I don't really care. I just kind of need to know the basic shape. It does mean, yes, that my corset is like shrinking down a little bit. I find I can check things just fine by like tugging it around and playing with it. But if you really want to like get that full effect and know for sure what you're looking at, go ahead and stick a stick of boning in the middle of each panel and go ahead and bind the top and bottom just with some bias tape or something to hold those in. That again is like a personal choice. How involved you want to get in your mock-up process is very individual to everybody. I just want to know if things fit and then I'm moving on usually. Much like doing the final corset, you also want your mock-up to obviously be in really rigid fabric that has no stretch. Oftentimes you'll see me do mock-ups in quilting cotton because then I can like take my mock-ups and cut them up to make quilting squares and stuff. I won't do that with a corset because quilting cotton does actually have quite a bit of stretch. So I just check my stash or my scraps and see whatever I have. Usually I don't care if things match or not. It's just to see if it's gonna work. First, let's talk about the underbust. This I was experimenting with. I've never tried this before. When I do a mock-up, I usually just punch a hole through the fabric and that's good enough to get my fit. But I'd seen some other people do mock-ups and put these strips with the eyelets. I gotta be honest, it didn't really matter to me. I think I probably would skip that next time. Now when I sewed on these boning channels, this is just bias tape. It's cheap, it's fast, you don't have to make it. It comes in sizes that are gonna work for most boning. To me, that is the quickest, easiest way to do boning channels on a mock-up. To sew those boning channels on, I used, I don't know if you can see it very well, this is a guided foot. and it's for edge stitching. It's an edge stitching foot. I find this super, super helpful because there's nothing worse than trying to slide in a piece of boning and like there was a moment where you sneezed or had to look away or something, and your boning channel, like your stitch kind of went a little wonky, and then you're trying to like force it through a narrower part of boning channel. These are worth their weight in gold. And on this corset, I did just use 1/2 inch seam allowances, and because all of my boning channels are in the center of my corset panels, I have access to pinch and do whatever I need to do to these once I try it on. So that'll be interesting. I'm a little nervous. Okay, before we can try this on, we gotta lace it up, obviously. So you can lace top to bottom or bottom to top all the way through if you like. I like to lace top to bottom, and in the center, I leave myself loops with which to pull the corset tight. So once I get to the middle, after zigzagging my lacing back and forth, I'm going to take the same piece of lacing on the same side that it came out of and put it back in that same side. And that's going to give me little loops in the middle, and the corset just pulls closed nicer that way. Once I get to the bottom, I'm going to tie the ends together in a knot. And this allows me to open the corset really, really wide so I can slide it up over my hips. Now, I'm not gonna lie, fitting a corset on yourself, by yourself, if you have nobody around, can be difficult. If you need somebody to come and do an adjustment on the back of the corset, like it can be hard. So if you have somebody around that can help you, awesome. The main thing that you are looking for when you put on your mock-up is you are looking for a fairly straight lacing gap. If your gap is like this, or like this, or like this, that's a sign that things are not right in the fit. It should be like this with your laces running in between. Your corset pattern should tell you what the lacing gap should be on the back of your corset. So for the Ariana one, it was supposed to be a 2-inch gap. So I know that it should be 2 inches the whole way. Anywhere where it's less than 2 inches, that means that part of the corset is too big. Anywhere where it is more than 2 inches, that part of the corset is too small. Okay, so we all knew that this was an experiment to see how well it would fit me, and as my lacing makes a diamond shape in my back, obviously I need to do some more, I need to actually do some tweaking to these pattern pieces. To me, because I need to take in the top and the bottom and let out the middle, that to me, that's just not worth doing on the mock-up. I mean, obviously I'm doing it a bit backwards because it was an experiment. But I'm just going to go back to those pattern pieces, and I will eventually because I've cut boning for this thing now, so I don't want that to go to waste. But I'm going to just carry on with this corset now for next week for my final corset, because I have like a whole bunch of work to do to that other pattern. So I'm gonna pump the brakes on that. I'm gonna leave it for a while. This is the one that I did so many alterations to the pattern. I made it taller, I made it narrower in places, I made it wider in other places. It does have a front closure, so there is a busk. And I thought, since it's, you know, a mock-up just for funsies, I would try putting some piping in the gore, because why not? And this one, you can see I poked holes right through the fabric, and that's where I laced this one up. So it worked totally fine. Okay, so here is the overbust corset. I don't have a lot of boning in here, and I'm trying it on right side out. As I'm tying it up, it's going fairly well, except it comes together too close at the bottom. That means that the bottom is too big for me. This is where I fumble trying to tie a bow behind my back. All right, I actually feel like this fit is pretty close, except for at the bottom here. I think I'm going to have to take in on this fourth panel here, I think is where I'm going to take most of that excess in. I feel like it'll work better there. But I want this size of gap all the way down. So I'm just marking on the pieces because that's just such a hard place for me to pinch or pin. So I'm going to mark where I want to take my excess in. And I know that my pieces are touching at the back. So as long as I take in about 2 inches, I feel like it should probably fit okay. At the top, I need to take in a little bit right at the top of the bust. And I'm going to put a skirt hook at the top of my finished corset. My bust, I got the longest one that there was, and it still wasn't quite long enough for this corset on me. So a skirt hook will be fine at the top. But I just have to remember to keep holding it closed while I'm doing the fitting so that I make sure that I'm not going to pinch too much off at the top of the bust there. And this just shows why it is so important to do all of those adjustments that we did to our patterns early on, because there's so much less to tweak. I mean, what do I have to do on the overbust corset? I gotta take in a little bit at the hip and a little bit at the bust. And it's so much easier when you're doing a fitting to only have to take things in and not have to let things out. Once you get your mock-up on and you have it inside out and you've pinched your seams or open seams or whatever you need to do for fitting, then you need to transfer that information onto your pattern pieces. Here is the super cool part. Once you have a corset pattern that fits you, that you know the pattern pieces are the right pieces to fit your body, you can really play around with it. You can take a full bust to an under bust to a waist cincher. You can play with the top and bottom lines. That's maybe something that we'll get into. So at this point, I have my fitting issues sort of figured out. I have my pattern pieces adjusted. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this. I'm going to take out the lacing at the back because I can reuse that. I'm going to take out the boning because I can reuse those. I'm going to number them so I know kind of whereabouts in the corset or what corset pattern piece they go to. And I'm going to cut the busk out because I will use this same busk in my next corset, my next version of that corset. And yeah, so next time I'll have like a properly all done corset. And next time I'm going to tell you the 3 different ways to apply boning channels. We'll go over those as well. So that's it for this week. I hope that was really helpful for you. I hope that you're enjoying this series. It has been really fun for me too. And yeah, that's it. I'll see you next week.